and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makbool with you at BTV World. In today's show, of course, we will be taking a look at the UN General Assembly session, which will be addressed by the Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif in a short while. Of course, the main issues that we have seen at the UN General Assembly relevant to Pakistan are with regards to climate change and the kind of issues that we're facing in terms of our economic instability and how that has deteriorated even further in light of these devastating floods and how they will be, of course, affecting our future days and months as well. There is, of course, the large loss and damage estimates that have come forward in the aftermath of these floods, many which don't reflect the ground realities and perhaps the assessment that will continue to exist much later after the water recedes. But this is, of course, something that has been reiterated by the UN General Assembly session and different leaders at the session, by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and the Secretary General himself when he talked about the kind of issues that the world has to face and the global dynamic that currently exists in terms of course, the kind of efforts that the world needs to put in for collective action against issues such as climate change. Of utmost importance to Pakistan, of course, is the kind of problems that we are facing in terms of financing the disaster response, since, of course, the current estimates put at $30 billion, which is a huge amount, and that seems also a conservative estimate of what Pakistan will have to bear with regards to these floods. There is also the issue of the economic instability and debt that Pakistan is burdened with, which has been spoken by the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister as well on various platforms on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session in terms of something being looked at by the international financial bodies and creditors, and how countries need to take a look at debt relief for Pakistan and provide support for countries such as Pakistan who are at the brink of climate change, and to help them be able to resolve this issue. We are, of course, also going to be seeing much more in terms of the kind of meetings that exist and the kind of issues that will be raised. The Prime Minister is also expected to talk about these things and other issues on the platform of the UN General Assembly session, but much remains to be seen in terms of what sort of action will actually happen. Will the world be able to provide the kind of sustained support that Pakistan needs, and can we actually talk about debt relief and the financing windows, considering loss and damage discussions in the discourse of climate change, result in some sort of tangible action and help for Pakistan? This is going to be the focus of our segment today, and we're going to be taking a look at this along with the PM's address to the UN General Assembly session soon. For this and more, as always, I've been joined in the studios by our senior analyst, Farooq Batafi, and I've also been joined in the studios by Mr. Syed Javed Hassan, who's Chairperson, Economic Advisory Group. Thank you very much for joining us and being a part of the debate. Mr. Javed, we're, of course, going to be taking a look at what really is the kind of economic impact. And I'd like to talk to you more with regards to that. But let me just welcome in the debate our guests online as well who have joined us, Dr. S.M. Ali, Adjunct Professor, Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Khaqan Najib, former advisor, Ministry of Finance. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us in the debate today. So, Mr. Javed, considering, of course, that Pakistan has been reiterating its stance in terms of relief that has to be provided with regards to the situation that we're currently in the aftermath of these floods, this seems straightforward enough for countries who are suffering, such as Pakistan, because of climate change interactions. But in the larger response that we have seen from the international community, not just to issues such as climate change, but also in terms of financial help to Pakistan or countries like Pakistan, it seems to be much more complicated than just that. When we talk about issues such as debt relief and financing windows with regards to loss and damage for climate change, will that be something that will be taken up seriously by the international financial bodies and can be talked about in terms of the kind of responsibility that exists of those countries that are contributing much more to global carbon emissions? Because moral responsibility is one thing, but when we actually talk about the economic and financial actions needed, is the international community ready for that?
Thank you very much, Sana. It's interesting, we were talking about before the floods about the perfect storm, where you had global commodity prices, the super cycle, plus the fact that the energy commodity prices have been dramatically going up, plus there was the Ukraine war, which had an effect on supply. All of this was pushing up the demand, the supply shortages, which pushed up prices and had a huge constraint on our balance of payments. That itself was difficult enough to be then for the perfect storm to be combined with the floods, we have really been put in a position where things have been dramatically worsened. So in Pakistan situation, the last thing we needed was the kind of floods we have seen in the last month or so. Now, in terms of global attitude towards us, initially the response was slow, but what we are now seeing, there's gathering momentum in terms of understanding how climate change is affecting countries like Pakistan. We have had recently a personality like Angelina Jolie coming here, you've had Guterres coming here, but you've also now heard President Biden talk about it. I think the IMF managing director has talked about a $100 billion fund for countries like Pakistan, which have been very adversely affected by climate change. Obviously, this is not exclusively Pakistan, but there are many other countries. So I think to answer your question, Pakistan is probably one of the worst affected by climate change, having not contributed much to it. So it has a very strong case to demand some degree of compensation from the rest of the world. We have to be obviously very careful about it. The last thing we want to do is talk about moratoriums, because that spooks the financial markets, and we've seen that today. But we have to really look at the kind of obligations we have. The commercial and bond market obligations, by and large, I think those we should not touch, but they're not that much for Pakistan. Of the sort of 130 billion of loan, probably less than 30% is in terms of commercial and bonds. The vast majorities are the multilateral or bilateral. Much of this would be very beneficial to Pakistan if some of it could be actually completely swapped or written off. But it would be even great help if some of this is defrayed or rescheduled or reprofiled to a much longer term. Because one of the problems that Pakistan faces is that every year it seems to have this maturing loans which keeps increasing the size of what is due. And that has a very negative impact on the markets, and effectively the markets are closed. If a lot of this debt is reprofiled so that we have some of this going 10 years, like as it happened in 2001, we will actually see some of the credit markets open up for us. And that will be very, and moreover, the sort of bond market rates, the credit default rates, which are prohibitive right now.
Right, absolutely. And we'll continue the discussion, Mr. Ali. We'll take a short break and be right back.
Его превосходительство Мухаммада Шахбаза Шарифа. Прошу службу протокола проводить его превосходительство. Я с большим удовольствием приветствую премьер-министра Исламской Республики Пакистан, его превосходительство Мухаммада Шахбаза Шарифа, приглашая его выступить перед Ассамблеей.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Qul ya ibadiyallazina asrafu. Qul ya ibadiyallazina asrafu. La taqnutu min rahmatillahi. Inna Allah yaghfiru dhanuban jamia. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, as I stand here today to tell the story of my country, Pakistan, my heart and mind have not been able to leave home. Standing here, I still feel that I am visiting one of the flood-affected areas of Sindh and Balochistan of my country. No words can describe the shock we are living through or how the face of the country lies transformed. I have come to explain firsthand the scale and magnitude of this climate catastrophe that has pushed 1/3 of my country underwater in a superstorm that no one has seen in one's living memory. For 40 days and 40 nights, a biblical flood poured down on us, smashing centuries of weather records, challenging everything we knew about disaster and how to manage it. Even today, huge swaths of the country are still underwater, submerged in an ocean of human suffering. In this ground zero of climate change, 33 million people, including women and children, are now at high risk from health hazards. With 650,000 women giving birth in makeshift tarpaulins. More than 1,500 of my people have been gone from this world in this great flood, including over 400 children. Far more are in peril from disease and malnutrition. As we speak, millions of climate migrants are still looking for dry land to pitch their tents on, with heartbreaking losses to their families, their futures, and their livelihoods gone for long times to come. Early estimates suggest that more than 13,000 kilometers of metal roads have been damaged, over 370 bridges have been swept away, 1 million homes have been destroyed, and another million damaged. More than 1 million farm animals have been killed. 4 million acres of crops have been washed away, stripping the people of their breadbasket, and damage of an unimaginable scale. Mr. President, Pakistan has never seen a more stark and devastating example of the impact of global warming. Life in Pakistan has changed forever. I have visited personally and spent time in every corner of my devastated country. People in Pakistan ask, why? Why has this happened to them? When global warming rips apart whole families and an entire country at this ferocious speed, it is time to ask why, and time to ask not what can be done, but what must be done. The undeniable truth is that this calamity has not been triggered by anything we have done. Our glaciers are melting fast, our forests are burning, and our heat waves have crossed 53 degrees Celsius, making us the hottest place on the planet. And now, Mr. President, now we live through an unprecedented monster monsoon. It is literally a monsoon on steroids, as the UN Secretary General described it most befittingly. It is on steroids. One thing is very clear: what happened in Pakistan will not stay in Pakistan. As the Secretary General so candidly says, hotspots like Pakistan fall in the 10 most climate vulnerable list of countries, but emit less than 1% of the greenhouse gases that are burning our planet. It is therefore entirely reasonable to expect some approximation of justice for this loss and damage, not to mention building back better with resilience and strength. Clearly, the time for talk about action has passed. At this point, I am profoundly grateful that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited Pakistan, where he spent time with climate refugees, with mothers and children in the tents, and repeatedly assured us of his support and assistance. At this point, I want to thank each and every one of the countries that have sent help to Pakistan and their representatives to Pakistan to stand in solidarity with us in our most trying hour. On behalf of my nation, I once again express my sincerest appreciation to all of them. Excellencies, the impacts on the health and wealth of my country are beyond calculation at this point. So my real worry is about the next stage of this challenge, when the cameras would have gone or left this August assembly and the story just shifts away to conflicts like the Ukraine. My question is, will we be left alone, high and dry, to cope with a crisis which we did not create, not of our doing? Where from and how to begin with to rehabilitate and reconstruct after the rescue and relief effort, which is still going on for 12 long weeks? For many of the lives we have saved, the future is dimmed by new fragility, lost homes, decimated livelihoods, deluged croplands, permanent food insecurity, and exposure to uncertain futures. Some 11 million people will be pushed further below the poverty line, while others will drift to cramped urban shelters, leaving little room for climate-smart rebuilding. Mr. President, for now, we have mobilized all available resources at our domain, squeezing resources from left and right towards the national relief effort, and repurposed all budget priorities, including development funds, to the rescue and first-order needs of millions, cash transfers to the most affected 4 million women, heads of household, had begun weeks ago via our social security program, the Benazir Income Support Program. It has been established in the name of former late Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, and her son is our foreign minister today. 70 billion rupees, or almost $300 million from our own pocket we are spending on this program. But at this point, the gap between our urgent needs and available resources is increasing by the day and amplified by the sheer unprecedented scale of this disaster. Our manpower and resources are totally overwhelmed and overstretched. The question to raise here is quite simple. Why are my people paying the price of such high global warming through no fault of ours? We have no contribution in this. Nature has unleashed her fury on Pakistan without looking at our carbon footprint, which is next to nothing. Our actions did not contribute to this. The dual cost of global inaction and climate injustice are having a crippling effect on both our treasury and our people, right here, right now, over there. Mr. President, this is going to be a long haul, and under these most trying circumstances, hope is the best enemy of darkness. And Pakistanis are known to be exceptionally resilient people. For my part, I am fully committed, fully geared to fighting this battle for our survival in the tents, in the trenches with my people, until we have rebuilt Pakistan to face the growing challenges of this century. It is high time we took a pause from the preoccupations of the 20th century to return to the challenges of the 21st century. the entire definition of national security has changed today. And unless the leaders of the world come together to act and act now on an agreed common agenda, there will be no earth to fight wars over. Nature will be fighting back, and for that, humanity is no match at all. Mr. President, Pakistan's urgent priority right now is to ensure a rapid economic growth and lift millions out of poverty and hunger. To enable any such policy momentum, Pakistan needs a stable external environment. We look for peace with all our neighbors, including India. Sustainable peace and stability in South Asia, however, remains contingent upon a just and lasting solution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute. At the heart of this long-standing dispute lies the denial of the inalienable right of the Kashmiri people to self-determination. India's illegal and unilateral actions of 5th August 2019 to change the internationally recognized disputed status of Jammu and Kashmir and to alter the demographic structure of the occupied territory further undermined the prospects of peace and inflamed regional tensions. India's ruthless campaign of repression against Kashmiris has continued to grow in scale and intensity. In pursuit of this heinous goal, New Delhi has ramped up its military deployments in occupied Jammu and Kashmir to 900,000 troops, thus making it the most militarized zone in the world. The serial brutalization of Kashmiris takes many forms: extrajudicial killings, incarceration, custodial torture and death, indiscriminate use of force, deliberate targeting of Kashmiri youth with pellet guns, and collective punishments imposed on entire communities. In a classic settler colonial project, India is seeking to turn the Muslim-majority Jammu and Kashmir into a Hindu territory through illegal demographic changes. Millions of fake domicile certificates have been issued to non-Kashmiris. Kashmiri land and properties are being seized. Electoral districts have been gerrymandered, and over 2.5 million non-Kashmiri illegal voters fraudulently registered. All this is in blatant violation of Security Council's resolutions and international law, particularly the 4th Geneva Convention. For our part, the Pakistani people have always stood by our Kashmiri brothers and sisters in complete solidarity and will continue to do so no matter what, until their right to self-determination is fully realized in accordance with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I assure the World Forum and this August platform that we in Pakistan remain consistent in our commitment to peace in South Asia. India must take credible steps to create enabling environment for constructive engagement. We are neighbors and we are there forever. The choice is ours, whether we live in peace or keep on fighting with each other. We have had 3 wars from 1947 onwards, and as a consequence, only miseries, poverty, unemployment increase on both sides. It's now up to us to resolve our differences, our problems, our issues, like peaceful neighbors through peaceful negotiations and discussions, and save our scarce resources for promoting education and health and employment to millions of people, young boys and girls on both sides of divide, and not waste our resources in buying more ammunition and trying to promote tension in this area. I think it's high time that India understands this message loud and clear, that both countries are armed to the teeth. War is not an option. It is not an option. It is not an option. Only peaceful dialogue can resolve these issues so that the world become more peaceful in times to come. Mr. President, Afghanistan today presents a unique challenge. 30 million Afghans are left without a functional economy. And banking system that allows ordinary Afghans to make a living, to be able to build a better future. Pakistan would also like to see Afghanistan, which is at peace with itself and the world, and which respects and nurtures all its citizens without regard to gender, ethnicity, and religion. Pakistan is working to encourage respect for the rights of Afghan girls and women to education and work. Yet, it is at this point, isolating the Afghan interim government could aggravate the suffering of the Afghan people who are already destitute. Constructive engagement and economic support are more likely to secure a positive response. A peaceful, prosperous, and connected Afghanistan in our collective interest. As a neighbor, Pakistan has a vital stake in peace and stability in Afghanistan. We have led the humanitarian efforts to help our Afghan brothers and sisters. We must avoid another civil war, a rising terrorism, drug trafficking, or new refugees, which none of Afghanistan's neighbors are in a position to accommodate. Pakistan urges the international community to respond in a positive way to the UN Secretary General's appeal for $4.2 billion in humanitarian and economic assistance to Afghanistan. Release Afghanistan's financial reserves, essential to revive its banking system. Pakistan shares the key concern of the international community regarding the threat posed by the major terrorist groups operating from Afghanistan, especially ISIL-K and Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, as well as Al-Qaeda, ETIM, and IMU. They all need to be dealt with effectively and comprehensively with the support and cooperation of the interim Afghan authorities. In turn, the international community should address Afghanistan's dire humanitarian needs. Mr. President, Pakistan strongly condemns terrorism in all its forms and shades and manifestations. Terrorism does not have a religion, ladies and gentlemen. It is based on dogma, fueled by poverty, unemployment, deprivation, injustice, and ignorance, and fanned by vested interests. Pakistan is the principal victim of terrorism. Over the last 2 decades, we have suffered more than 80,000 casualties and over $150 billion in economic losses due to terrorist attacks. Our armed forces, with the support of our people, mothers, traders, students, teachers, engineers, doctors, have broken the back of terrorism within Pakistan, yet we continue to suffer terrorist attacks from across our borders, sponsored and financed by our regional adversary. We are determined to defeat such cross-border terrorism. And I must say, loud and clear that the amount of sacrifices Pakistan has made to defeat terrorism over the period of time has been unprecedented in the contemporary history of Pakistan. I tell often to my friends, if you see somebody, a mother or a child or a boy limping on the streets of Pakistan, maybe he was a victim of terrorists years back. That is the kind of sacrifice Pakistan has paid. Our generals, our soldiers, our doctors, mothers, teachers, students, and traders, they all paid their lives for Pakistan's well-being and defeated terrorism. And this peace which was restored back in Pakistan after great sacrifices is not only for Pakistan, it is a peace for global countries and global community. And we are very proud of it. And this is the biggest manifestation of our commitment, our concern, and our continued efforts to defeat terrorism wherever it is. Mr. President, Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. Since 9/11, suspicion and fear of Muslims and discrimination against them have escalated to epidemic proportions. The officially sponsored campaign of oppression against India's over 200 million Muslims is the worst manifestation of Islamophobia. They are subjected to discriminatory laws and policies, hijab bans, attacks on mosques, and lynchings by Hindu mobs. I am particularly concerned by the calls for genocide against India's Muslims by some extremist groups. Earlier this year, this assembly adopted a landmark resolution introduced by Pakistan on behalf of the OIC, designating 15th March as the International Day to combat Islamophobia. It's my sincere and ardent hope that this should lead to concrete measures by the UN and member states to combat Islamophobia and promote interfaith harmony. Mr. President, Pakistan is deeply concerned by the numerous conflicts across the Middle East, including in Syria and Yemen. We support all possible efforts to promote their peaceful resolutions. We call on Israel to put an immediate end to the blatant use of force and flagrant violations of human rights of the Palestinian people and the repeated desecration of the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque. The only just, comprehensive, and lasting solution of the Palestinian question is the acceptance of a viable, independent, and contiguous Palestinian state with the pre-1967 borders and Al-Quds, Al-Sharif as its capital. Mr. President, the Security Council and the General Assembly must be empowered to play their respective roles under the UN Charter. The Security Council must be expanded by adding 11 new non-permanent members to make it more representative, democratic, transparent, effective, and accountable. Adding new permanent members will paralyze the Council's decision-making, enlarge its representational deficit, and create new centers of privilege in violation of principle of sovereign equality of member states. The nations of the world must step back from the precipice. We must restore peace in Europe, avoid a war in Asia, and resolve festering conflicts across the world. We must revive the vision which created the United Nations, a vision which is often blurred by national interest and hegemonic designs. Pakistan is a partner for peace. But, Mr. President, peace can only be ensured and guaranteed when rights of communities who have been suffering over decades and subjugated over decades get their freedom, earn their freedom, and are respected. In this behalf, before I conclude, Mr. President, I would once again repeat at the cost of repetition that we want to have peace with India, but long-lasting, enduring peace can only be ensured and guaranteed through a just and fair solution of Kashmir, providing rights to the people of Kashmir under UN Charter, according to Security Council resolutions, the right of self-determination, and I will be most forthcoming to sit down then and talk to our Indian counterparts to pave the way forward for future so that our generations do not suffer, so that we spend our resources on mitigating miseries, on building structures to face these floods and outbursts of clouds. We are developing societies. We don't have unlimited resources. We must deploy our resources for the well-being of the people, for our children, for their promotion, for their empowerment, for their employment, for health, for education, and make Pakistan, and of course other developing societies must find their own place in community of nations through hard work, untiring efforts, and sacrifice. That is the only way forward. Therefore, we will work with all those committed to the United Charter's principles to restore the vision which created the United Nations and to equip this organization with the capacity to preserve global peace and promote universal prosperity. I thank you.
От имени Ассамблеи хочу поблагодарить.
That was Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif addressing the 77th session of the UN General Assembly, in which he called out a various number of issues, of course, starting off with the most current and relevant issue of the devastating floods and the impact of climate change in Pakistan. He started off by talking about this massive scale of loss and damage that has affected more than 33 million people in Pakistan, which is 1 out of 7, and the kinds of loss and damage that have occurred and the numerous people that are suffering at the moment, and the kind of response that is needed from the entire world community to help in this climate change catastrophe and to understand the urgent requirement of global collective action against climate change, and that it in fact impacts all of us, and that those who are more responsible in terms of global carbon emissions also need to realize this fact. He also talked about how Pakistan is currently facing a gap in the urgent needs and the resources that exist in order to meet that, especially in light of the devastating floods. There was, of course, the economic instability that has been impacting Pakistan since before these floods as well, and now, of course, considering the kind of loss and damage that Pakistan has faced and will be dealing with in the next coming days and months in terms of relief and rehabilitation, there is a lot of resources that will be required to go towards a disaster response, and Pakistan needs as much help as it can from the international community with regards to these floods. We also know that he talked about how there are issues of national security that impact everyone around the world, and it needs to be global collective action against that. He mentioned specifically the issue of Kashmir and the unilateral actions of 2019, talked again about how war is not an option, and that he and Pakistan, of course, wants to pursue peaceful dialogue, given, of course, that Kashmir is given their right to self-determination, and that there is a fair and just solution for the people of Kashmir. He also talked about Afghanistan and the kind of humanitarian and economic crisis that is unfolding there, and the kind of dysfunctional economy that exists, and how the world needs to respond in terms of urgent needs of help with regards to the economic stability within Afghanistan, and also called out to the Afghanistan regime to provide the security of not allowing their territory to be used against any other ones, and also for various terrorist groups that he mentioned to be able to protect that from not just from Pakistan but other areas as well. He also talked about how there is this, of course, the entire issue of counterterrorism within Pakistan and the spike in terrorist activities that Pakistan has been dealing with, which has paid numerous sacrifices in the global war on terror. And this is something also that the entire global community needs to be acknowledging and speak about in terms of global change and the spike in terrorism around the world. He also mentioned the issue of Islamophobia, which is a global phenomenon, and that he is, of course, appreciating of the fact that 15th of March was adopted as an international day to combat Islamophobia, and that there is much work that needs to be done with regards to that. At the end, he also talked about various crisis issues, especially in the Middle East, in terms of Syria, Yemen, the issue of Palestine, and urged upon the global community to look at these issues as well and to move towards peaceful dialogue. He also talked about the United Nations in itself and the entire vision of revising that vision in terms of what the UN actually meant and stood for, and for the entire global community to work together for that. Also talking about the Security Council and the issue of adding permanent members to it, which will, according to him, not be able to be fulfilling in line of the vision of the UN, and this is something that Pakistan does not support. At the end, he reiterated his call for peace with India, but of course at the prerequisite of Kashmir and a just and fair solution for the right of self-determination for the people of Kashmir. This was what the Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif talked about at the 77th session of the UN General Assembly session. Of course, he started off with something which is very, very relevant to us. And Farouk, when we take a look at, of course, the entire speech, a large chunk of it was focused on what Pakistan is currently facing, which is the devastating floods and how we'll be able to cope with it. On numerous accounts, even prior to the speech, the Prime Minister has spoken about what sort of help or need is required in terms of how the international community must respond. But of course, this platform in itself and this speech had its own impact. And when we take a look at what all has been said and the kind of issues that have been highlighted that are relevant to Pakistan, first of all, what you make of the speech, and then when we talk about specifically of the climate change issues and the global call for action, there is a lot of emphasis on collective action from around the world. Will we be able to see that sort of impact coming in, and will this particular platform be able to pave the way for us?
Absolutely, Sana. I think it was a very important speech. As we were listening to the Prime Minister, usually whenever the Prime Ministers go on this forum, there is this talk of the word or time economy, that you have to actually focus on certain issues, and then you might actually leave out certain issues as well. And because there was this concern about floods, there was also this concern that many important issues might be buried deep or they might be left out. But what happened was that the Prime Minister dedicated a big portion of his speech focusing on the flood situation and the needs, and the gap between the needs and the capacity to fulfill those needs. And then he also went on and talked about all those issues which you just mentioned. Kashmir is very close to Pakistan's heart. Terrorism is something that we have lived through. And of course, then the policy discussion about how India is actually behaving, what is going on in Palestine, elsewhere. And then, of course, the talk of the UNSC expansion as well. I'm really glad that when he spoke about Afghanistan, he also mentioned the terrorist groups that can find space there. He spoke about ISK, Al-Qaeda, ETIM, TTP, and then IMU as well. So that was an indication that it was a well-prepared speech. It had all the substance that was needed to be conveyed there. And then remember, yesterday also I was talking about this, that in the past it has happened at the time of crisis. Sometimes we send not the Prime Minister, like India has not sent its Prime Minister, but instead they dispatch their Foreign Minister or some other minister. It is important when you are pitching Pakistan and when you are actually fielding for Pakistan that you send the top guy. So the Prime Minister was there. He made this impassioned appeal to the world community for the help. And I think that it was, I'm actually impressed that in coming days I see that there is going to be a result also. I expect that in coming days there will be substantial, from what we are hearing, there is this recommendation from the UN that earlier was also discussed to suspend the debt repayment Of course, our markets easily get spooked, so they immediately thought that perhaps it is about the commercial debt, but that is not the case. It is bilateral or multilateral payments. And we have been talking about this, that there should be a credit swap with the capacity building funds so that Pakistan can invest in climate resilience. So there seems to be some early indications that that might also happen. And if that happens, it doesn't mean that Pakistan's economic burdens are over. That means that what you are going to, you were going to pay to the world, now you are going to invest in your own country's climate resilience. That won't be easy. That won't be that quick a task. It will be a humongous task. Let us hope that happens.
Absolutely. And of course, the impact of the UN General Assembly session and the speech should be something that we should expect and hope for, that would result in some sort of action or discussion. There is, of course, the issue of the floods and climate change that has not only been mentioned in this particular speech, but on the sidelines as well. Mr. Ali, if we take a look at the particular issue of climate change and floods, of course, there is the concern that whenever we have these discussions, especially on platforms such as the UN General Assembly session or even the COP27, there is a lot of emphasis on expressing solidarity, something that the Prime Minister in his earlier interview with Bloomberg also mentioned, that there is now time for that solidarity to be turned into action. What impact do you think the speech must have had on the international community, along with the way that the issues of climate change has been reiterated by other global leaders?
There was room for hitting the ground running because the fact that Pakistan has had these floods is a reality. I mean, but we live in a big bad world where there's an inundation of issues. Of course, the Ukraine is at the fore, but every country. This is a platform for every country to to put their urgent issues of concern, and generally there is the fact remains. I mean, Fatma Bhutto had just written about this. I mean, we're going to be speaking actually at the embassy because the foreign minister is coming to DC, and these discussions are being had. I think what we start to think though is how DC is viewing this. So already there's a concern that Sindh is the hardest hit area, and and in Sindh we currently have I mean, there's political representation, of course, from Sindh, and there's already finger pointing by the international community towards Pakistan itself, because I mean, these are neglected climate issues. Yes, it has a minuscule economy, and hence it does not have the ability to have ecological damage as other countries like the US do. And that is a fact. But I think that there could have been more clearer asks, for instance. So, I mean, at the UN Secretary, at the General Assembly, talking to even the bilateral relationship with the US. Now, we know that the Indus water basin, and we're already seeing glacial melt exacerbating in northern areas, the floods. That was an issue to talk about. I mean, there's need to climate proof at the very least the Indus Water Treaty. Now, that is a multilateral agency negotiated, US funded treaty, and it desperately needs climate proofing. So I think that those were the more tangible asks to have put at the table and hit the ground running, right? And these are ones not...
Right, absolutely. And we'll continue the discussion, Mr. Ali. We'll take a short break and be right back.
Also advocated for the inclusion of loss and damage on the COP27 agenda, and we brought this issue up at the COP meeting on the sidelines of the UN as well, and we're optimistic that there will be a healthy discussion of issues related to loss and damage at the upcoming COP.
Mr. Azim.
Yes, this is Azim Mian from GEO and Young Group of Newspapers. Mr. Foreign Minister, you and Prime Minister were here on a mission and to make the international community aware of the plight of the Pakistani victims of disaster. That has been accomplished everywhere. This has been mentioned by more than many speakers and the UN Secretary General. So that's one phase. But have you devised any kind of mechanism to materialize the promises or pledges being made by the international community? So far, I think 60 million out of 160 million announced has been done. So on your part, your government has got so many domestic problems as well, but what kind of mechanism has been materialized?
So as far as
this aid reaches to the victims transparently, effectively, and in a very meaningful ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So as far as the 160 million initial flash repeal, I believe we've gone beyond that to 75% of our target, but actually there will be a renewed flash repeal given the size and scale of the damage. Actually, we're still in the rescue relief phase. We haven't entered into the rehabilitation phase. There's still large sections of the country not only underwater, but this water is steadily descending towards the sea, and as it does so, it engulfs and harms other areas. Once the water does truly recede, we will be able to get a more accurate damage needs assessment done. We're doing so in accordance with the World Bank to ensure accuracy, transparency, etc. Once we do have a damage needs assessment, then everyone from the UN Secretary General to the President of France have offered to help us in order to galvanize the international community and to engage with international finance institutions to be able to overcome what is an incredibly overwhelming situation. As far as the aid received so far, as far as the pledges pledged so far, as far as the assistance given so far, it's all a drop in the ocean. 33 million people. That is more than the population of New York State that we're sitting in today. It is more than the population of many, many countries who were represented here today and spoke at the United Nations. So whatever we're doing, whatever the international community is doing so far, is just a drop in the ocean. And it will take us a long time to recover from this tragedy.
Thank you. Su?
Hi, this is Dr. Xu with China Central Television. I have two questions. First, you just mentioned about a chain action by this flood. The flood leads to health crisis, and then might be a potential food crisis and the economic crisis. So where do you think is the weakest link you can break the chain, and how to do that? And the second question is concerning today's meeting, the G77 and China. The Secretary General, in his remarks, he said, and I quote, "The global financial system was created by rich countries to benefit rich countries. We need to balance the scales between developed and developing countries and create a new global financial system that benefits all." Do you agree with that, and how exactly, as the president of G77 and China, would like to do with this?
So as far as the challenges that we're facing going forward, we're really taking them one at a time. And at the moment, while we're still battling with floodwaters, we really have to focus on rescue and relief and see how we can support those victims of this tragedy. Going forward, we have to have a comprehensive plan for reconstruction and rehabilitation based on the still to be completed damage needs assessment component. But that plan for rehabilitation and reconstruction is where we have to create the opportunity within this crisis. The world had to adapt, we had to mitigate, and we also have to adapt to the new realities of climate change. And the devastation that this flood has caused has given us, or will give us, the opportunity going forward to not only reconstruct, rehabilitate, and rebuild, but to do so in a better manner, to do so in a greener manner, to do so in a more climate resilient manner. As far as the UN Secretary General's comments on the international financial system, he was with me today at the G77 plus China group that Pakistan was chairing, where he reiterated his remarks, calling the international financial system morally bankrupt, and pointed to the fact that many African nations were not part at the forming of these institutions. Many former colonized nations were not free and a part of such institutional frameworks, and therefore he's given a call for us to reassess how the international financial frameworks work, and for them to do so in a more just manner going forward.
Efrain.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Good to see you, Mr. Foreign Minister. I have a question on Afghanistan, if you don't mind. Your Prime Minister today mentioned that some work is being done on gender rights in Afghanistan, and in his speech, very quickly. We had Afghan women here in this very room a couple of weeks ago, and they seem to be feeling and thinking that the OIC is not doing enough to support their rights, and that the OIC has levers with the Taliban that they're not using to support the cause of women there. What's your response to that? And then as the chair of the OIC, and also as the son of the first Muslim woman to head a democratic government in the world, the late Benazir Bhutto, what's your message to Afghan women and to the Taliban regarding that issue? And then I have another question, if that's okay.
Just let me answer this one. So as far as the Prime Minister's speech is concerned, he did call on the government, or the interim government of Afghanistan to respect their citizens' rights regardless of gender, etc., if I'm correct. As far as the situation on education is concerned within Afghanistan, particularly female education is concerned in Afghanistan, while we recognize that there's primary education available to women and there's segregated tertiary education available to women, Pakistan, along with the rest of the international community, is waiting for the interim Afghan regime to implement secondary education for women as well. As far as my message to the women of Afghanistan and the women of the Muslim world, this I don't believe is an issue of the international community, or not just an issue of the international community. This should be an issue for the Muslim world, for the Muslim Ummah, and you're indeed correct, for the OIC as well. Because Islam is what first gave women their rights. Islam is what guarantees women their rights to participate within society and their right to education. So we expect not only Afghanistan but across the world for women to not only be guaranteed these rights, but these rights to be protected. I'm actually currently the chair of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC, and I am trying before our chairmanship expires, God willing, to be able to hold an event under the auspices of the OIC to do with women's rights in Islam.
New York Raja Bilal Bhutto Zardari.
That was the Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, along with the Permanent Representative Pakistan to the United Nations, Mr. Munir Akram, regarding the press briefing after the Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif's speech at the UN General Assembly session. He was talking about various issues that were highlighted by the Prime Minister in his own speech as well, and he was answering a number of questions with regards to the action plan to materialize the pledges. There are, of course, numerous countries that have pledged certain amounts for the relief fund to the flood-affected areas of Pakistan and for relief and rehabilitation activities within the country. The amount of the pledges, all of it has not been recovered so far, and so the question regarding the action plan was put forward to the Foreign Minister, who talked about how this is something that is important to Pakistan, and they will be taking a look at different avenues of how to take this forward and the global response that is required in terms of the international community to step forward and to be able to support sustained growth. He also talked about how there will be continuous assessment with regards to what is happening on ground, along with the World Bank, that will be giving estimates as to what loss and damage has occurred within the country after the water recedes, which is going to take a while. So they will be in a better position to understand what sort of aid and help they require from the international community and how to go about it in terms of rehabilitation efforts. He was also asked about the chairing of the Group 2077 and China's session that was earlier chaired by Pakistan and by the foreign minister. And he talked about how, of course, the international financing response is quite important, something that he has reiterated on various platforms on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session, and talked about how there needs to be a restructuring of the debt policy with regards to international financial institutions for flood-affected countries and climate change-prone countries such as Pakistan, and talked about how this was something echoed again by the UN Secretary General as well, in terms of how the global system with regards to the international financing institutions and the way that different countries around the world are bearing the brunt of climate change needs to be revised so that more help can be given to the developing countries, and how there needs to be urgent and long-term measures with regards to that. There was also another question with regards to gender rights within Afghanistan and what needs to be done with regards to the female education within the country, which is of course cause of much debate in the international community, to which the foreign minister talked about and also referred to the Prime Minister's speech, which mentioned Afghanistan and the commitments that have been made by the interim Afghan government, which talks about what needs to be done in terms of providing secondary education to women. He also spoke about Islam giving due rights to women, and this was something that forms the basis of gender rights within the world, and is something that needs to be also looked at within Afghanistan, not just by the international community, but by the Muslim Ummah in general, and particularly the OIC countries, which the foreign minister spoke about, is something that he plans to emphasize in his future engagements with the OIC. We will now be going to Dr. Khaqan Najib, who has joined us online. Thank you very much, Dr. Khaqan, for being so patient and waiting with us on the debate for so long. There is, of course, news coming in from the UN General Assembly that we keep going to. But considering what has been said earlier by the Prime Minister of Pakistan and the Foreign Minister on various platforms, and referring to what has just been said by the foreign minister and in his speech by the prime minister as well, is of course issues of climate change and the kind of devastation that has occurred in Pakistan. But in reference to that, how do we mobilize the kind of financial support that is needed for us to be able to recover from this damage that is going to last for months and years? Considering what has been reiterated in the UN General Assembly session and along the sidelines, what sort of efforts are you looking at in terms of the collection of the kind of humanitarian aid that we're looking for in the pledges, and then also, of course, moving forward, the emphasis on sustained support for Pakistan to be able to move towards more climate resilient infrastructure, and also the possibility and option of moving towards debt relief or debt swap for Pakistan to be able to focus on developing that infrastructure?
Sana, thank you for having me on your show. It's my pleasure to be on PTV World, as always. Sana, I mean, before we even came into the floods, Pakistan's economic situation was very tough. Yes, the exogenous, the external circumstances were tough, but our own house was also in difficulty with a high current account, which means we had a balance of payments challenge, which was rising. We tried to get out of it by going to the IMF. But at that time also, we needed support of our friendly countries, especially Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and China. In the hope that we could, pass through this challenge unhurt, and then came the floods. The floods, of course, as many times as we reiterate, the DNA, the need assessment is still in the offing, but hopefully we will have something by mid or end October. But the early estimates are quite high, in the north of $30 billion. But what's most important is for us to sail through this year. And sailing through this year itself is very difficult when we have to look after 33 million people who have been displaced. We have to, build 1 million houses when we have to, look at the damage to livestock, more than 1 million. We have to build, good 15 to 30,000 kilometers of roads and, 400 bridges. So all that requires a lot of money besides relief, rescue, and rehabilitation and building of the infrastructure. So the challenge has become, manyfold. Now, how do we move about that? So I think the very first thing is that we need to have budgetary support so that we have room to help these people. That's the most important thing. And that's where the role of the multilaterals comes in very, very handy. So I've heard that the World Bank has decided to repurpose money. Fair enough. Repurposing means that they were going to build some infrastructure somewhere else that could go to the flood hit areas. Now it's our duty to really fasten these projects so that we can get the money and start rebuilding the infrastructure so that the connectivity stays. So I think that's the very first order of business. Then we need help in terms of tents. About 7 million people need to be in tents because they don't have a place. And of course, we can't build those kinds of tents ourselves. So we need INGOs and others to help us. So that's number two. Now, moving on to more substantive economic challenges, Pakistan's cotton crop is destroyed. Pakistan's rice crop is affected. Pakistan's wheat sowing is going to be delayed. And only today I was looking at the large scale manufacturing number, and there is a decline month on month, year on year. The year on year decline is about 16%. So you can see the kind of hit we are taking. On the agriculture side, I think we are going to hardly have any growth. On the services side, maybe a little bit, but on the overall industrial growth, also in the low digits, and overall growth is going to get hurt. That's going
Right.
to hurt the economy overall.
Right. Dr. Zab, I'm glad that you were talking about all these ways to actually handle these challenges. Let me ask you about our debt to GDP ratio and the concern that if because you brought up the matter of World Bank actually repurposing the funds and investing in infrastructure, how important it is that it should be grants, not loans, because then Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio also further increases.
So, Pratap Sahab, talking about debt is a very important issue. And it's an important issue because this year we need about $21 billion so that our amortization of the debt that we need to repay and our interest are met. That's $21 billion, right? In that, what can be done? Uh, I think the first thing that we can learn from history, and the history tells us that Paris loans have twice been rescheduled. The Paris loan was rescheduled under General Musharraf's time, and then also done when the COVID government hit under the PTI government. And we had a debt relief, which was called DSSI, and that was to the tune of $3.7 billion. We got a grace period of 1 year. It was G20 countries as well as the Paris Group. And I think that's something that could be done immediately, and it should not bother anyone. And that's about $1.175 billion. So that would give you, over $1 billion of budgetary support, which you don't have to pay. And I think this time the grace period should be more than 1 year, at least 2 to 3 years. And the repayment period should be maybe 6 to 8 years so that we get help for FY23. The multilaterals can schedule new loans to us. So there are two kinds of loans that they give us. One is project money. And as I said, repurposing is one thing. What you've said rightly, that they could also give us some grant and aid. And that would be welcome, and some instrument could be used there. And bilaterals could also use grant and aid instrument. But the multilaterals can go beyond the repurposing and start giving us new project aid. Project aid, Patafi Saab, is the easiest and the best way to access money. Long term, very low on the interest.
Right, Dr. Khan, of course, when the Prime Minister was speaking, he also mentioned the fact that there are, of course, urgent needs that we need to be able to fulfill, and our resources are, of course, not that plenty. And then when we take a look at this gap, it's huge, and we need that sort of help from the international community. But what I want to understand is that when we take a look at all of these issues and what we're proposing, we're still facing this issue at the moment. We are, of course, dealing with economic instability at home and the kind of devastating floods and the economic impact that has had. And of course, we're trying for all of these avenues to be opened up for countries like Pakistan. But what sort of a time frame does Pakistan have in terms of being able to go through the kind of food security issues, of course, the health outbreak that is there in flood affected areas, and then our current economic and political considerations as well? It seems that we require urgent help in this regard, but the kind of actions that we're talking about perhaps will take a lot of time.
So, Sana, that's a good point. What we can do on our end is to expedite the damage need assessment. I think that would form the basis of approaching for bigger monies. You've seen a UN appeal, so we got $165 million. So let's get that money in quickly. That's not much to do with DNA, but DNA must be done as quickly as possible so that we can approach for the new monies very.
Right, absolutely. And we'll continue the discussion, Mr. Ali. We'll take a short break and be right back.
Independent or free at the forming of this of our international system, and within that context is calling for reform. I don't imagine that this is something that would be an overnight reform. It would require extensive engagement and will take some time to achieve, but particularly within the G77 context, many of our member states are advocating for something.
Thank you very much. They are finishing because there's another press conference here, so we have to finish. Anwar Iqbal. So.
Thank you very much. What would be climate justice for Pakistan?
So, if a country's output or carbon output is 0.8%, but they're the 8th most climate stressed country in the planet. They've become the epicenter of extreme climate events. That, as the UN Secretary General said, we're not only drowning in floods, we're also drowning in debt. So climate justice would mean that those countries that we do enjoy relationships with, these larger industrialized, richer countries, whose industrialization has contributed far more to climate change than Pakistan, would engage with Pakistan in a sympathetic manner. Not only a sympathetic manner, I believe we can come up with win-win solutions where we can use the opportunities created by this crisis for a green Marshall Plan or a green Silk Road in order to rebuild, but rebuild in a way that's climate resilient, that's greener, and that's more appropriate for the difficult times to come.
Thank you.
My mission, my message for the women of Afghanistan is that I am with you and I will always be with you. They should be allowed to go.
Islam, they always talking about Sharia law. Pakistan is our neighbor. Pakistan has influences to them. Mr. Sharif mentioned that Afghanistan is safe haven for terrorists. Why we suffer?
So as
so many women, no delegation from Afghanistan, no woman. I'm a woman, suffered woman from Afghanistan.
Absolutely,
You're our
ma'am.
neighbor. I interviewed your mother.
Really?
She was friend of mine. She
I
was
see.
wonderful, but we suffered. This is 40, 50 years that Afghan people suffer.
Absolutely. I think that the government in Afghanistan will soon find that it is not wise to fight with the women of your own country.
Thank you.
And the women of Afghanistan are truly brave, resilient women. They've had to be too brave for far too long. But I'm honestly, this is a topic that we don't give up on. This is something that we consistently engage with the interim Afghan regime. And while there is access to female education at the primary level or the tertiary level segregated education, we do hope to see the day that secondary education is also allowed for women and girls in Afghanistan. And we say it again and again and again that this is not an issue for the West. This is not an issue for America or the United Kingdom or the European Union. This is an issue for the Islamic world and Muslim women across the Islamic world who've been granted their rights by their religion, and we should not compromise on their rights.
I'll take last question, Shabir. Sir, last.
She's the boss. She's the boss.
Last question, Shabir. We are done. Okay. Shabir, you can have a last question. Then we
tell
will
me, who am I answering?
Can you please?
That was the Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari addressing the media briefing at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session after the Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif addressed the high-level debate. There were numerous questions being asked to the Foreign Minister, and he reiterated the fact that Pakistan contributes about 0.8% to global carbon emissions and still is the 8th most stressed country in the world with regards to climate change issues. And this is, of course, something that the countries more responsible towards global carbon emissions need to take into account. These issues of moral responsibility and accountability are something that have been reiterated by the Pakistani delegation again and again on the platform of the UN General Assembly session. We also, of course, know that the Foreign Minister was asked the question of female education in Afghanistan and of gender rights within the country, to which he responded that he stands with the women of Afghanistan, and the fact remains that they are in fact brave and resilient women and perhaps have had to be too brave for too long. And this is something that the Foreign Minister reiterates, that the discussion regarding gender rights and the right of females within Afghanistan to education is something that is always on the agenda for Pakistan, and that they are continuously engaged with the interim Afghan government on this particular issue. This is something that was, of course, focused on in the discussion by the Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari in his media conference at the moment in the UN General Assembly session. Mr. Javed, of course, when we take a look at the kind of issues that have been raised, again, the aspects of financial help towards Pakistan in these devastating floods are something that have been reiterated by the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister. There is, of course, concern in terms of how soon this can actually happen, or whether or not we're looking for something that can be tangibly worked upon. But when we take a look at the kind of issues that Pakistan is facing currently, and the way that the floods have impacted the economy and are continuing to do so in terms of other sectors such as food security issues, what sort of measures do you think are immediately required so that we can actually look towards issues such as debt relief? Because when we talk about all of this, there needs to be perhaps a larger restructuring of the entire system, or perhaps an avenue to be created that doesn't exist at the moment. That seems to be something that will fundamentally require a lot of global consensus and action. Can we expect that to happen soon?
It must happen soon. First of all, I think it's imperative that there's some debt restructuring. We can't simply keep rolling over one year debt to the next. And what happens as amortization happens, that pile keeps getting larger and larger every year. So this year we might have had 21 billion of payments. Next year it will be 35 billion, and this keeps getting larger because all loans keep getting amortized, and every year we just keep rolling by 1 year. What we need is a reprofiling of this debt so that a lot of this debt gets pushed back. One of the guests said 7 years, but I would say more like 10, 15 years, as it happened in 2001. Definitely the Paris Club loans. Also what we need is, rather than further loans from the multilateral, what we need is direct grants. Really, the debt sustainability is probably at its limit. We really can't afford to have more debt, external debt being taken on. And that will give us the reprofiling of the debt, plus more grants will actually give us some space, both in terms of fiscal space as well as our external debt sustainability. Once we have that, then we can start looking at restructuring the economy, where there's obviously internal changes that need to happen, and most importantly, in terms of climate adaptability. One of the reasons why we have suffered as much as we have is because the adaptation to climate change has been relatively poor. That's partly because of resources, partly also because the focus has probably not been there. So all of these things we have to do, and really we don't have time. It's not as if we have had this flood one year. The monsoon have changed, and we are seeing more and more of this happening every year. So I think the globe is aware, and I think what has happened is that the multilaterals have been sensitized, the United Nations is sensitized, and it's good to see people like President Biden, Macron, all of these world leaders are now beginning to realize, and now it's a question of how hard we push it and how quickly we push it.
Right. Javed Sahab, I'm glad that you're talking about debt restructuring, because as it was pointed out today by other analysts as well, that 30% of our external debt is we owe to China, right? We are asking the rest of the world to actually redo it as well, or restructure. Can we also ask our Chinese friends and others to do exactly the same? Secondly, since you were talking about investing in improving the infrastructure, domestic infrastructure regarding climate change, there is one concern that has been highlighted, that we had not to this magnitude, but kind of similar deluge back in 2010. And that was an early warning that this can happen again. But we kind of actually let that moment go. Why would that be?
Well, there were several reasons why. I mean, it has to be understood that Indus Valley is a floodplain. Yeah. This doesn't simply happen 10 years back. It happens as far back as the films of 1920s. So this is a floodplain. It does happen, and moreover, the population growth has been such that more and more people are living on the floodplains. So there is the climate change. That is a reality. We can't deny that. But there is also the fact that there's much more population which is being affected, which has come closer to the rivers, closer to the floodplains. So these are two, but we need to really see how adaptation has to take place. Some of it is not that expensive, like the left bank outfall in Sindh. That potentially could have been done in, now probably it'll go in hundreds of millions. That was much less cost earlier if we had done it so. There's similarly other mitigation measures that could have been taken earlier. Let's not focus on what has been done in the past or hasn't been done. Yeah. We really need to focus on the future, and the future can't be too far away.
Yeah.
It has to be.
But the only concern is that now you'll have to show more willingness to actually do it, so that you can convince the entire world. Over to you, Sana.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. You were adding something, Mr. Javed?
No, I was saying it is not a willingness, it's an imperative.
Yeah, absolutely. But it seems that when we take a look at what has been said earlier also, Farooq, and by the foreign minister right now also, there is a lot of focus on the moral responsibility or accountability of nations who are contributing more to global carbon emissions. And it seems that that is perhaps forming the basis, and rightly so, of the argument that when we're talking about developing nations and those more prone to climate change issues to be able to get this sort of relief. But in terms of actually moving forward towards resolving a mechanism moving forward to help developing countries face and go through such climate catastrophes, will that be ground enough for us to move forward to that there is a moral responsibility that exists?
I think that this moral responsibility does exist, right? It is there. Sure. And I'm glad that we have actually framed it well regarding climate justice, right? We were not presenting the case in this way in the past. I think that now we have learned from our mistakes, and I think there's more cognizance of the fact that this is because of climate change. One, the international community and their teams have actually come to Pakistan, and they have seen for themselves the kind of damage that is done. Secondly, then of course, because of the climate change and the renewed focus after President Trump, when he actually decided to quit Paris Accord, and now the US is back in there. Because of that, there's a renewed emphasis on climate responsibility as well. So it is important that Pakistan keeps on pushing the case, and I think that there is this understanding on behalf of the world community as well that they have to take responsibility too. I'm not merely saying it because they keep on having these conferences, COP 26, 27, further on, like the one that is about to be held in Egypt. I think that there is serious expectation or hope that you have to bring about change and you have to take responsibility. Unfortunately, our own people, our intelligentsia suffer from what I called ants or automatic negative thoughts. We immediately start convincing ourselves that everything is lost already, and that the world community doesn't have the kind of funds to bail you out. I think that we have seen with Ukraine, we have seen with Russia, the kind of Western might there is, and they can, if they want to mobilize, they can really come to your aid as well. And I think that the fact that a big part of our annual budget actually goes to debt retirement. If we get some kind of rescheduling, I would rather go for waiver or swap. But if that doesn't happen, ages ago there used to be one initiative called HIPC, Highly Indebted Poor Countries, debt waiver. If that cannot happen, at least reschedule it to an extent so that Pakistan gets the fiscal relief, that instead of sending money out, you can spend on your own people who are really devastated at this moment. You see that triple whammy at this moment. Economy was in bad shape already. Then came the flood, and because of flood, people are affected and displaced, and their livelihoods and houses have been destroyed. The third whammy, and that is also important, is we are an agrarian country, and all our crops are destroyed. All the areas where you used to plant crops, they are destroyed. So we need a kind of relief package that is needed at this moment, and the world sees it. So I hope that in coming days we can shun these ants and focus on what we need and actually keep on presenting our case. One last comment regarding $100 billion fund that Javed Sahab was mentioning earlier. It was agreed upon in Paris Agreement as well, that the affluent countries will actually bring together this fund. We saw commitments, but only recently, the fund has been created. It doesn't have that kind of money, but it will soon be replenished. Let us hope in coming days we see real direction taking place, and then of course Pakistan needs a very coherent plan so that we can tell or show our international partners as well, and we can actually then go to our own people and mobilizing their resources as well, rebuild the country. Remember in the Second World War, after the Second World War, because of the recession, and all that kind of circumstances, when New Deal came, when other, similar kind of projects came, economy started reviving. So at this moment, we have this lingering fear of global recession. Perhaps some kind of commitment to climate change can also put an end to those fears.
Absolutely. Dr. Hakan, when we take a look at, of course, the kind of considerations that we have at home, especially in terms of the economic situation, there is, of course, the concern of the debt relief, and then, of course, the kind of issues that we're facing in terms of the bailout package with the IMF as well. When we take a look at what is going around in the news, there were a lot of discussions regarding Pakistan defaulting, and parallels earlier were drawn with Sri Lanka as well. And it seems that we keep fluctuating between issues of Pakistan defaulting or not. And there seems to be mixed data coming in. It's not very clear what really is going on. And then we also have the report that has been talked about with regards to the UNDP in terms of putting forward a memo that Pakistan needs to go for debt relief, and otherwise there are going to be a lot of issues, which of course has impacted the economic situation as well. So we of course see all of this, and then Mr. Miftah Ismail has also shared about how the kind of commercial bonds that Pakistan needs to be repaying are there, and that in December we will be making the payment as is due. So when all of this is happening and the kind of situations with regards to the flood exist, what exactly is the real picture in terms of economic situation on ground? And then when we talk about such memos coming in, what sort of an impact are they having on our economic situation?
So let me start with commenting on something, our reliance on the world. I'm not a very big fan of reliance on the world, and you have to see the world rightly. This is a world where there is donor fatigue. When you went to your friends to ask for money, all your friends said, go to the IMF and then we will give you money. The Fed rate hike has pulled money from the emerging countries, and the safe haven status of US is heightened. And lastly, there is the Ukraine war. So whatever hopes we create, we have to be very factual about it. Even today, and I've spoken to the World Bank, I work internationally, they have done an 850 billion rupee, sorry, $850 million repurposing, then another $350 million repurposing. We must remember that these are repurposing of monies. So that's where the world stands. On the IMF and on our default status, I have always said, and let me repeat this, Pakistan is going through a very severe dollar liquidity crunch. Till we understand that it is this crunch which is causing you the issues, we will not solve it. Why are you going through this? Because your reserves at $19 billion in September 21 have gone down to, before the IMF, at $7.6 billion the day we went to IMF. The delay in having IMF as an anchor when there was a global difficulty and when there was a domestic challenge on the BOP has caused us to get where we are, where the multilaterals also did not go ahead with the project and the program financing, and Pakistan ended up where it is. So now moving on, one, you have to remember that without an IMF being an anchor, you cannot solve anything because that is the doctor of the last resort. So you must stick to it to solve one issue, which is your dollar liquidity crunch, which the floods have made worse. On the second thing, on the debt reprofiling, also you have to be very careful. One, Pakistan's debt is denominated largely in local currency. Only 36% of Pakistan's debt is foreign, the rest is all local. In that foreign debt, as soon as news came today, I think there was an overreaction, and I spoke to some of the bond managers abroad as well, and I said, Pakistan will pay the $1 billion in 22 on the 5th of December. We owe about $8.5 billion in euro bonds till 2050. What we can immediately move on is the bilateral debts. We can move on with the countries, like you rightly mentioned, China, where we have safe deposits. We can re-roll them. That will give confidence immediately. You do the bilaterals, China, and the other rollovers happen, so that will calm the markets. On the multilateral front, the immediate is that beyond the repurposing, you need to have new monies coming in. Good news for the viewers and for the countries that Asian Development Bank is likely to approve a new facility for you. It's an expensive facility, but it's a facility without going into much what we called development-linked indicators. It's a simple facility, and you are likely to get $1 billion to $1.5 billion there. That would help. On the commercial side, I was looking at Pakistan. We have about $3.5 billion we need to move this year, which we should be able to either re-roll them or give them back and take them again. But new monies have to come in. But new monies, besides this, for the flood, once you get your DNA, then you pitch your projects, and that is the work again you have to do. The authorities have to do. Just one last comment.
Yes,
we talk about this global picture and the global blame and the 0.8% emissions. What we don't talk is that your problems are local. What is going to solve them is going to be the local government. Your nadi nalas, your areas where you need to create, better impacts are going to be solved by the local
and our
government.
glaciers also?
No, not the glaciers, but of course, I mean, that's part of
Dr.
the
Saab,
problem.
this is, I respect your view a lot, and it takes me a lot of courage to actually disagree with you on certain points. I totally get when you're saying that we cannot rely on pipe dreams or these castles in the air, that somehow the world is going to align itself and come to our rescue. Having said that, is it not a concern that we keep on saying, talking about, when I was talking about ants, that Pakistan is most allied ally. Pakistan has lost 80,000 people to the war on terror. For past 40 years, Pakistan has been fighting for every great cause in the world. And then, of course, a calamity strikes, and then we are so badly hurt. At that time, why do we keep on thinking, or at least believing as an article of faith, that there won't be any mobilization of international funds or support, and whatever we are going to get is in bits and pieces, only in terms of loans rather than any big relief? And why can't we actually negotiate or renegotiate the entire system? Because Pakistan has been playing a very key role in defining and redefining the world order as well.
Right, and I also want to add, with regards to your emphasis on local administration and the fact what local government can do and contribute, of course that's there, but when we're talking about global impact of climate change, of course that is true also. How much change or help or protection can we really provide by local governments at home?
So of course, all I'm trying to say is that, local setups can mitigate a lot of what they can do. I'm not saying that, we should not do, of course, we should raise this. We should raise that we are 0.8% of the carbon emissions, all these things said and done. But the homework that we need to do, whether we needed to do them after the last floods from 2010 onwards, we must be as inward looking as we should be outward looking. The problem will not go away if we are not inward looking, strengthening our own ability to do what is needed to do, build resilient cities. You can't take that away. The reliance on the external world is fine, but I mean, if your domestic resource mobilization stands at 10% of GDP, people, when I deal with the fund from the Pakistan side, they ask me what you want to do about it. And that's a fair question. That's not an unfair question. We have been saying we will improve it by 5 percentage points for last so many years. It's our inability to do so. So what I keep always saying is, go raise your case, build your narrative, and negotiate well, right? That's Patafi Saab is absolutely right. We can negotiate better also, even on the fund program. I've always said it's a matter of good negotiation. I think the fund should be helping us with a financing facility they called Rapid Financing Instrument. In COVID, they gave us $1.4 billion. Again, we should be looking at some funds from there. I think the current program should be enhanced as well. We have done a lot. Under very, very difficult circumstances. Of course, that should be. So while you keep on doing all that, you also keep on building resilience within the country. And that's the only point I would make.
Absolutely.
Right. Yes, Mr. Javed, you can add to that as well. But I would also like to bring in, when we take a look at, of course, the kind of situation or responsibility that exists as home, there's, of course, the issues that we were in discussion with prior to these floods, which is with regards to a charter of economy, the kind of economic reforms that we've talked about since many, many years now. And this is, of course, something that needs a lot of effort and focus at home as well. And then, of course, prioritizing our climate change needs and being able to mobilize our resources and being well prepared for future such catastrophes and issues as well. How much of our efforts need to go into that plan B as well too? Because when we're taking a look at the kind of issues we need from the international community, I want to understand the stakes involved in terms of us not being able to achieve that, and then of course being able to do this on our own. Do we really have a plan B in place? And if we do, then what all will it entail?
Just to start on IMF,
Sure.
It would be great, as Dr. Khan say, if we can raise more funds or get an enlargement of the facility from IMF. But my understanding is we are near the limits of our facility in IMF, both in terms of rapid financing as well as whatever structural facilities may be. So we probably need to look at other multilaterals like World Bank, ADB, as well as what can be generated through the UN facilities. In terms of your second question about what we need to do, there is obviously a lot of structural change within the economy that has to take place. In many ways, Pakistan is not working. Its productivity growth has been slowing down year after year. We are left behind when we compare to India, definitely even Bangladesh now, but we shouldn't even compare with countries like Vietnam. We also need to look at a very basic fiscal issue, which really which Farooq Saab addressed, is in terms of debt in fiscal space. If we don't actually raise enough taxes, when tax to GDP ratio remains year after year at 9-10%, we obviously don't create fiscal space. It's a question we beggar that everyone says everyone else should pay. Nobody wants to pay. So you have large chunks of society that do not pay taxes, and they find every excuse under the sun not to pay taxes. Now the question is, we can't simply ask the same people to keep paying more taxes. So we need, I dare say, the sort of agricultural sector, the trading sector, the small businesses sector, even some of the professionals who take cash, they need to start paying taxes. It is something in most of the countries, even neighboring countries. India has a tax to GDP ratio which is close to 20%. We can't survive for very long if we continue to have 10% tax to GDP, and where 56% of that obviously goes to the provinces. We need to see the provinces actually start raising more revenue for their spending. If you look at the federal system in Canada, for instance, much of the spending that happens in the provinces, but much of the revenue generation also happens in the provinces. We need that
and the local level as well.
At the local level. So it's a three-tier level.
Can I seek a little bit of clarification when you talk about how provinces, the share of revenue pie? Are you saying that we need to actually restructure NFC award, or we need to redo the 18th Amendment?
Look, that's a very loaded question.
No, but it is.
I don't want to necessarily restructure, but the fact of the matter is that we have to take into account the fact that at 10% tax to GDP, by the time we pay off the NFC, we don't have enough to even service debt or do any other federal spending. So we really are stretching ourselves to the limit. So what we have to do is borrow externally. If we have to borrow externally, that affects our sustainability. We're already piling on debt. What fiscal borrowing you do at 7-8% deficit effectively has to come from somewhere, and that has to come from, if you're not going to print money, that comes from borrowing externally. We already are stretched externally, and we do not want to. The reality is, if our debt sustainability level is at the limits, if we go further, we might find some of the multilateral agencies will stop lending to us. So, it is pretty serious.
It might be a loaded question, but your answer was also signaling towards something, right?
Yes.
You were pointing out that something needs to be done. So could you also tell us what that something might be?
I think rather than looking at whether 56% should go to, we really should ask the provinces to raise much more of the revenue that they spend. It is simply not possible for the federal structure to raise much of the revenue, go to the provinces without. There should be more property taxes, there should be more land taxes, there should be more excise duties in some of collection. I think some of it is simply about collection capabilities at the provincial level. So really, we have come to stage. So that is at a very basic level. There is also the fact of the matter is Pakistan, in terms of exports to GDP, is one of the lowest among the top top 20 nations in terms of population. We rank right at the bottom. Our exports to GDP is only 10%. Bangladesh is close to 25%. If you look at Vietnam, it is something like 100%. With this kind of non-connectivity. We are not integrated with the rest of the world. And that's why we keep running into balance of payments crisis.
That is going to be a very long debate, Dr.
Right, so
and we are going to have it another day.
Farooq, very quickly, we've raised the issue at the UN General Assembly session, and we keep talking about debt relief, but how do we go about actually making that into a tangible reality for us after the session is over?
The first thing, if you actually come back to Pakistan and Pakistani politics, every politician keeps on talking about begging, this, that, other thing. I tell you, I believe in Sir Syed Ahmed's philosophy, who, when creating Aligarh University, said that he had a big beard, right? Aging man. He said that I wouldn't mind dancing for the audience if I can raise the funds. At this moment, it is very important. One podcast, very famous podcast called Tim Ferriss Show, featured David Rubenstein, the head of Carlyle, founder of Carlyle Group, and they actually handled $230 billion worth of funds. And he said that the first principle of raising money is don't take no for an answer. Keep on going at it and keep on asking people. When you do it, and I'm glad that we have a very efficient team sitting in New York right now, earlier Washington DC as well. Our foreign minister spoke well, our PM and our climate minister can also advocate this. Let us make it a deal for the life of this country, and I hope we can push forward and get that results.
Right, absolutely. Dr. Khan, very quickly, if we take a look at what Pakistan now needs to do in terms of debt relief, what will be our first step forward with regards to making sure that this discussion doesn't remain just that?
So our first step would be that we ensure that the bilateral creditors, the Paris Club, the G20, they are able to give us that relief. That could come very immediately. We can sort that with every country in the Paris Club, and then Japan and France. And once you have that, you get some space. Secondly, we must go to China and Saudi Arabia, where we have the rollovers of the monies that are placed with us. So maybe they can do a rollover beyond 1 year. We keep getting these 1-year rollovers, which you always have the sword hanging that you have to pay back. So maybe we can get and the reason I say that is that right now markets need comfort. Markets are very jittery about Pakistan. On the credit default swaps are high, our bonds are yielding much higher, and that doesn't give us access to the commercial markets. So if we are able to do so, that would help. And then, of course, new multilateral money.
Can I sneak in one line? Just one.
Absolutely no
Earlier you said that we need a charter of economy. I think we better have a charter on who will be the finance minister also, because we keep on changing finance ministers awfully quickly.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Hakan Najib, Dr. Javed Hussain, and of course, Mr. Muhammad Ali for joining us earlier, and of course, Farooq Patafi for being part of the debate. That's all that we have from the show. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.